The only way intelligence manifests itself is through behavior. So we can postpone the question of what is intelligent and what is not intelligent until we've understood the way behavior is brought about by an agent in his interactions with the environment.
It is a necessity for nature to make proteins fold safe and reliably. Imagine you climb Mount Everest, all of a sudden there's much less pressure on your cells and the proteins decide to fold differently. I mean, you die. Nature had to figure out a reliable way under a variety of conditions to produce these proteins, which are the building blocks of life.
My mom was sitting there, that was the living room, and she was drinking her coffee and was telling me all about the wall coming down. I remember grabbing her coffee cup and smelling it because I thought, she must be dreaming. But it was just coffee, and she was right, yeah.
Before we start, a quick technical note. During recording, the microphones malfunctioned. This episode was restored using AI tools. Oliver's cloned voice, however, has an accent which is different from his original voice. Details in the comments and description.
Welcome, Oliver. It's a pleasure that you're here. So let me first tell you my vision for this podcast.
Sure.
So first of all, I want to talk about maybe like three big topics. The first one is a bit like your origin story, because I always think that experiences really shape the way we think and influence our actions. So it's good to know where someone is coming from. And then I want to go all about intelligence. So I want to know more about your research, and I want to go a bit deeper on how we can actually create intelligence. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the future of robotics. So where are we going? What problems will happen there, and how we can solve them? So having said all that, let's go all the way back to your origin. So let us talk a little bit about where you have been born, how it was growing up, and maybe when was your first fascination coming up with robotics?
First of all, thanks for having invited me, and thanks for talking to me. Where I was born in Mainz.
Nice.
Yeah. But I only spent a couple of weeks there, I think, before my parents moved to Hanover.
Oh.
Nice. And then I think I was 8 or 9 when we all moved to Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
So I consider myself a Berliner. And I've gotten permission from Berliners to call me that, even though I wasn't born in Berlin.
All right.
But yeah, few people know that, and I try to hide it, that I was actually born in Mainz.
Well, but Mainz is not such a bad city, no?
Yeah, but not Berlin.
Yes, that is true. But that's a bit strange now, because at that time, Berlin was still divided and was like very difficult to actually get into the city.
Absolutely. I mean, you're dating me now. But it's true. I think I moved to Berlin, I don't even remember. It must be end of 70s to early 80s or something like that. A long time ago. Yeah. I mean, there was still a wall around Berlin. Berlin was where people went that wanted to avoid military service. And there was no industry except for a Bavarian motorcycle company that had a factory here. Yeah, it was very unusual. And my dad went here for career. And all his colleagues said, "Why are you going to Berlin? It's a lost cause." But I mean, the wall came down and I was proven wrong.
Yeah.
And Berlin was the place to be. Actually, Berlin was the place to be even then, even with the wall around. I mean, it was kind of a very interesting ecosystem, enclosed with very special rules. So I really enjoyed growing up in Berlin. It was a wild adventure.
And so when did it actually this all start with your fascination about robotics or maybe programming? So I guess at some point you had like access to computer or so, and you started writing some programs.
Yeah, I actually think you're right. It started with computers. When I was probably 13 or 14, the Commodore 64 came out. And I've been already fascinated with computers. I've been reading about transistors and how you build logic gates and so on, and how you can create computers based on that. And then the C64 came out, and I remember driving the bus to Adenauer Platz because there was a computer store there. And I took a brochure from the C64 and I showed it to my dad. I didn't dare to ask for that as a present because I think it was 1,400 marks.
Oh, wow.
Back then. But I got it for Christmas.
That's nice.
And I was super excited. Actually, just recently, an old kindergarten friend cleaned out her room and found a letter that I had sent to her after having received that gift, saying that, how excited I was and how I didn't dare to ask for it as a gift because it was so expensive. So that was, I think, a really transformative moment for me. My brother got a VC20 that was a smaller version and it was cheaper, so he got actually an external data, cassette tape to store programs, and he got 2 games. I only got the computer bare. So I had to wait at night when my brother was sleeping, steal the recorder to record the programs that I wrote. And the first thing I did was to recreate the programs, the games that my brother had received with his computer. So I sat there every night until 4 a.m. programming basically a very early version of Pac-Man and things like that.
And so how old were you at that time?
Yeah, 13, 14 years old.
Okay. And what kind of programming language was that?
Basic.
Basic. Nice. That's really old school.
Yeah. And then my father actually gave me some books, for example, Hans Moravec, Mind Children, Feigenbaum. In retrospect, he must have really researched this, right, and found some books. So I started reading about AI and things like that, and I wasn't completely hooked onto it, but I guess that laid the foundation. And then when I started studying computer science and started taking AI and robotics courses, that's when it kind of started.
So I guess when you were programming, you already knew that you wanted to go into this career, right?
Not at all. No. My whole life I wanted to be an architect.
Oh,
and then
okay.
when I was finishing my high school, then I thought I wanted to become a physicist. And I started studying physics and computer science in parallel, thinking that was a reasonable idea. It turns out that actually making 2 courses of study next to each other requires a lot of effort, a lot of work. And so then I had to drop one, and then I decided to drop physics because I thought computer science was a more stable career. But at that point, there was no idea of going into academia or anything like that. That really was, I didn't think about that.
So, but did you already had like a vision for your life at that point?
Everything in my life just happened. I don't think I ever had a vision for my life.
Okay, and so when you study computer science, it must have been like shortly before the Berlin Wall came down, right?
Yeah.
You were basically a student while the Berlin Wall fell, right? So do you still remember maybe the evening of this fateful event?
Well, that evening for me was very uneventful because I had been partying the night before.
Okay.
And then I decided to go to bed early. But then in the morning when I came down to have breakfast, my mom was sitting there. That was the living room. And she was drinking her coffee and was telling me all about the wall coming down. I remember grabbing her coffee cup and smelling it because I thought, she must be dreaming. But it was just coffee, and she was right, yeah. But then I might have said... So I missed the whole thing.
Nice.
But already then going to university that day, subway was completely packed. Everybody was carrying around bananas and pallets of Coke cans, and it was a crazy time.
Crazy. Okay, and then at some point you finished your diploma at the TU Berlin, and you looked for some kind of job, right? And it turned out that you got the opportunity to pursue a PhD at Stanford University. So how did that actually happen?
Well, I was coming to the end of my studies, and I have to say it, a student. And super naive. My idea of an academic career was that during your studies, a professor has to approach you and ask you whether you want to work with them. And if that doesn't happen, then you have no chance. Well, that didn't happen because it never happens, right?
So you thought actually that professors will pick out the most intelligent students and they can go on to have an academic career?
Exactly. I don't know why I thought that. Especially since my father actually is a professor, right? So I should have known. I could have asked him, but I didn't. And so I thought, well, now basically I need to find a job, as you said. And that really meant getting up at 7 every morning. And so to be at work at 8. And I didn't really like that. And then I heard from 2 of my fellow students, they were applying for a scholarship to go to the US. And I had worked with them, doing my studies, and I said, well, if they can do that, then I can do it too. And I decided to apply. I got the scholarship, and then I went to the US. I went to Stanford for 1 year to do a master's degree. Then I started to get organized, right? I asked people, so what do you actually do? And they recommended that I join the research groups of professors to kind of get to know. And so I did that. I started a small project with who then became my advisor. Yeah, then they applied for the PhD program after 1 year. Got in and...
And so you said your father was also a professor?
He's a neurosurgeon. So very different.
Okay, and then at Stanford University, you actually worked with one of the pioneers of robotics, right? Usama Khatib. So what did Usama teach you about research? Maybe something you still remember up to this day?
Well, it's really interesting because I really had different phases after graduating of realization how the influence really happened. I think it's less likely that somebody says a sentence to you that really changes your life, right? It happens rarely. But I really think how the biggest effect took place was by the environment that he created and by the kind of problems that we were investigating in this environment. So I really think I was lucky to experience his view on robotics and his approach to the whole thing as, as what fed me kind of natively from the beginning, right? I didn't get to know all the other worldviews. I got to know this worldview. And I think it proves to be one that is very helpful. And so I really think it was through osmosis and being around him and the people that he hired and the projects that he created and the whole environment really was forming.
And in this environment, what did you first work on? Maybe your first paper? Do you still remember that?
Yeah, of course. Everybody remembers their first paper. Well, the first thing I worked on actually was already part of my thesis. That was called the elastic strips. So I built, we were partially funded by Boeing at the time. And one of the research people from Boeing were coming over and I put together a demo illustrating how you could cover the local free space around the robot by using spheres, right? And you could do this at an interactive rate, which back then was surprising, right? So this idea is that by using spheres, which with one single distance computation gives you a volume that's guaranteed to be free of obstacles, that this is a primitive and can quickly compute a local free space. That was kind of, at that point, a new idea. And so that was my first demo. But my first paper was actually on a mobile robot, the XR4000, a holonomic mobile base.
And there you basically showed that elastic strips can already work on this robot, right?
No, that was actually independent. There was something that was called global dynamic window approach, which was a derivative of the dynamic window approach, which was something that Dieter Fox, Wolfram Burgard, and Sebastian Thrun had created. Also pioneers, not also, but they are pioneers in the field. So pioneers in the field. So that was a little derivative of that that worked really, really well. I combined it with planning. So it used to be like just a rack framework. That's where the goal came from. And that's actually, I think, one of my most highly cited papers still to this day.
If I look at those papers, there's clearly a lot of motion planning and control theory going on. And I think you were one of the first people who really brought them together, integrating them. So can you maybe talk a little bit about what motion planning and control means to you and how they can actually be integrated?
I think you're putting it exactly right. I mean, that was in some sense the task that Osama put me on, right? I mean, the idea that there are different temporal scales within a system, control being a very low-level scale that runs at high frequencies. And there are high-level scales, temporal scales like planning, which it's efficient to do it maybe once a second or so, as long as these things communicate well. And that's exactly where I worked at. At this intersection, I tried to fuse the power of reactive control with the power of global planning that are complementary in some sense. Yeah, and back then, computation was really actually a limit. So the question was, how can you do that in a way that's computationally efficient? Years later, people came up with very fancy sort of mathematical frameworks of optimization to effectively do the same thing. We had like a physics-inspired simulation that effectively was an optimization, distributed optimization, if you want, right? But yeah, effectively, that was kind of the same idea. Yeah. Planning and control. I have to say that recently I'm coming to the suspicion that they might not be the right categories. That behavior generation actually should be done differently.
So you mean completely differently in a completely different approach?
Well, I think completely different is very strong, right? I think we've done so many different things also across all fields that you can find resemblance in anything. So I wouldn't say that we really need to invent like a new algorithm, but it's about how you put the pieces that are there together, right? And you can put pieces together in ways that actually produce something really novel. I mean, we just recently actually at the past ICRA published a paper that's the title starts "No Plan but Everything Under Control," which is kind of a play on this dualism that we have in robotics and is replacing both with something that you could view as gradient ascent. You can visualize it as a factor graph, but it's really something else. It's more specific than that. And it generates motion in very surprising ways, you know. So if you want to have a robot that works in an unstructured environment, you either have to plan from scratch every time, right? You plan and something changes, you replan, something unexpected happens, you replan. Or you have a long list of routines that you can invoke in order to recover from that unforeseen situation. And this usually happens, people build a system, they see how it fails, they add some code to account for that situation, then they run it again, something else fails, and so you end up with like this patchwork of things. This is very different because all of these recovery behaviors don't even need to be explicitly specified. They just happen as a consequence of the representation. So this system exhibited recovery behaviors that we had not programmed and that we had not even anticipated. You know, we were sitting there saying, why did it do that? I mean, yes, that's the right thing to do, but we didn't intend it to do that, did we? And then found out that we did indirectly. And I'm very happy to say that Vito Mengers, the PhD student who was the first author on the paper, won the Best Paper Award for this at ICRA. So,
yeah, I saw that. Congratulations again. So I want to come back to that in a moment, but before that, I want to go quickly back to the year 1999. There happened something very, very special for you. So you actually started and co-founded a company called AllAdvantage, and you even became its CTO. And I found out that you raised over $200 million, and this website was in the top 20 websites worldwide, which is, yeah, I would say an amazing achievement. So what would you say? How did this idea actually materialize? And can you talk a little bit about how you found investors?
I mean, that's probably a podcast in itself. And actually, there was a book written about it that was called The $2 Million Cuff. Yeah, so I had a friend from Berlin that I've known since we were like 13 or 14 years old, from going out at night, right? And I ran into him by chance at Stanford, on the Stanford campus. And so, you know, we connected. Wow. and
the world is small.
Yes, absolutely. We connected and we started hanging out, and he was an engineer gone business. He had first done an engineering degree at Stanford, and then he went to the Stanford Business School, and he really wanted to start a company. So he basically called me every day and gave me 6 new business ideas because he really wanted this. And we had to particularly plan for a business plan writing competition. So we'd work together. We realized then, you know, we are complementary. I'm a techie, he's a business guy. We work well together, we get along. So he wanted to start a company with me. And he bombarded me with these ideas, and I shot down every idea for months after months after months. And then one day I said, that's interesting. And he dropped the phone, was jumping around like, oh, Oliver says it is interesting. We are going to start a company. So that's actually what happened, right?
And so what did he actually propose at that moment?
Well, I don't remember exactly, but I mean, back then it was clear that the play on the internet was a data play, right? What's valuable on the internet is the ability to gather data about people, right? It's not that this is really a new distribution channel. People are not going to buy more air filters for their car because now there's internet, right? It's some new business was created, but in the end it was just an efficient way of communicating. But that way it could gather a lot of data. And so realizing that this data that the consumer produces has value only if you aggregate over many consumers, right? You by yourself could not go anywhere and say, do you want to buy my data? Because that's worth nothing. But if 50,000 people together say, do you want to buy my data? That's worth something, right? And so his crazy idea, but ingenious, was to say, well, why don't we pay people for their data, right? I mean, we think there's value in the data, and why don't we just give the people their share, and we just take a tax, right? We just take your agent fee. And that sounded crazy, but the times were crazy because money was worth nothing at that point. There was so much money around. Nobody worried about dollar amounts. People worried about, can you grow fast enough? Can you hire fast enough? And if the answer to both of these questions was yes, then people gave you money, right? It was a very strange proxy for success. Growth, right? Growth. And so, we said, oh, that is interesting. We could pay people. And of course, in the beginning, we would have to pay people more than we're making. But since we can get so much money from venture capitalists, we can bridge that time until we build the infrastructure, until we build all the technology, which nobody had built before, to exploit that data, to value, to monetize it. And so we went to venture capitalist businesses, to VCs, and they said, you guys are crazy, right? I mean, you're telling me that I'm going to give you money, you're going to turn around and you're going to pay the internet that money, right? And you say sometime in the future you're going to make money from me. That I don't believe you. So we went back to the little garden hut of our CEO and we said, okay, what do we do? And we said, okay, let's just do it. Let's just fake it, right? Until you make it. So we created a website. We said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to pay you, 25 cents an hour that you serve. And everybody that you recruit, we're going to pay you 15 cents for every hour they serve. And everybody that they recruit, we're going to pay you 5 cents an hour up to 5 levels down.
Okay, but that sounds a lot like a pyramid scheme.
It is a pyramid scheme. It is completely a pyramid scheme, but a good one. Because in a pyramid scheme that people have to pay upwards, we turn around and we're paying downwards. So nobody gets screwed. Everybody gets money from us. Right? It's a pyramid scheme. It's a good one. It's called multi-level marketing, right? So in marketing, that's a term, right? That's a thing. And so we just said, sign up here, and we soon going to launch a product. We didn't have anything other than a database that also didn't work. I mean, so many stories. But anyway, so within, I think, 1 week, we had 2 million people that signed up. And I mean, today when companies have billions of users, that is not much. But back then, that was absolutely unheard of. And then we went to the venture capitalists and said, look what happened. And they immediately gave us money. I mean, they fought each other for giving us money. They could not get enough of this, right? So that was a crazy story. I mean, the end is that we were 2 weeks away from going public, in which case we would have raised, I think 500 million in the first round of public offering. But the internet bubble burst, right? And no company went public. And so this idea that money is free and you can hand it out very quickly became obsolete. Then we had to build a technology that nobody else had, and that still to this day people don't have. And we started to become a technology company. And that went actually well until all the internet companies that were our customers went out of business. So then all the venture capitalists went out. That was a crazy ride, and I learned so much. And I got a football table, and it's still in the lab upstairs.
And so what was your biggest lesson learned from that time?
The biggest lesson, I mean, like literally I came home every day and I sat down in my chair and I stared into nothingness. And I thought, my God, may I learn so many new things, right? I mean, I studied my whole life. And you think when you go to university to study, you learn a lot? No. These days was so, I don't know. I mean, there's many different lessons. There are lessons about how to work with people, right? And mostly I think the biggest lesson there is that it's not worth fighting with people, right? I mean, getting along in a team is worth so much that we pushed into a lot of compromises in order to maintain the fun level in the team, right? And so that I think was very critical. But I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about the internet. I learned a lot about managing teams. Lots of lessons.
I imagine. But I also imagine that it must be super difficult to be the CTO of a fast-growing company and at the same time doing a PhD, right? So how did you actually manage those two things? How did you balance that out?
Well, I wasn't the whole... I mean, basically, within the first couple of months of the company, I finished my PhD. And, I handed it in sometime in 1999. I used to go like at 10 p.m. after coming from the company. I used to go to the lab, work until 2 or 4 to finish, right? And then I handed it in, and the official confirmation of the degree was in January of 2000. But I finished it earlier, so I didn't do this in parallel for a very long time, and I highly not recommend it to do that. Right? All the PhD students listening out there, it's not a good idea. Finish and then do what you need to do. But to do this at the same time, it's not fun.
And then in 2001, I think, so AllAdvantage went out of business and you switched back to academia. You went to Rice University and you went to the lab of Lydia Kavraki, right? And so what made you actually do that move, and what did you want to accomplish at that time?
Yeah. So actually my plan always was to go to Lydia Kavraki's lab. After finishing my PhD, I wanted to do a postdoc, and I didn't really want to become a CTO. And the 3 other founders just said, Oliver, we're meeting the VCs today. Look, we need somebody who can speak tech. Would you just come along and you just pretend, just talk to them? And I said, well, of course I can, right? I mean, I'm not going to let you down. And so I went there, and there was no moment where I decided I'm going to be part of this company. It just happened, like I said earlier, right? All things in my life just happened. And so I actually was at Rice while working for AllAdvantage and was flying back and forth between Texas and California. Also something I really don't recommend. So I was flying back and forth a lot.
So how often did you actually fly back and forth?
Well, in the beginning, I think it was every 2 weeks, and I really had 2 8-hour working days. I worked at Rice for 8 hours, and then I came home, and then I worked on the company for 8 hours. And yeah, I mean, I lost a lot of weight, mostly because I forgot to eat, right? I mean, also it was a very intense time, right? It was a very intense time, a lot of fun, not very healthy, I presume, but fun. But at that point, I realized that that's not the right way to do it. Things started to turn to the negative for the company, and then I actually quit at Rice and moved back to the company full time. So those things were going on in parallel.
Okay, and then at some point you decided you wanted to become a professor, right? So in 2002 you started your own research group at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So how difficult was it actually for you to get a professorship at that time, and why did you actually decide to do that instead of like continuing on to your next startup adventure?
Well, I always, after having finished my PhD, I kind of was hooked on research, right? This idea is you can really think deeply about a problem, and you can think things that nobody before you had thought. I think that's super fascinating. The fact that you can actually figure out something, find something useful that's really new. I thought that was really appealing. And so I always wanted to do that. Then when AllAdvantage finished, I actually started consulting for a while. And I tell you, with consulting, you can make a lot of money. So I was not under financial pressure. And now I started to apply. I wanted to go back to Germany, actually. I was very set on going back to Germany. I applied for the Emmy-Noether program and actually got it. But it took so long, the whole process, that in the meantime, I panicked. I applied to 10 US universities. One of them invited me. And that university, UMass Amherst, also gave me a job. I accepted the job. I moved to Amherst. And I'd given my first class before I heard back from the DFG that I had gotten the Emmy-Noether. So then I said, well, I'm a professor now. I mean, that would be a step back for me. And I want to do it. I want to come back to Germany. But can we kind of swing a deal? And the DFG was very complicated about it. And in the end, they made it impossible. So that's why I stayed in the US. It paid off, yeah. So it was a good decision.
And then one of the first bigger projects which you tackled with one of your first PhD students was actually not directly on robotics, but on protein folding.
Yes.
Which at first glance has nothing to do with motion planning or robotics or control. So can you quickly tell me what is the relation of protein folding to robotics, and how did you become fascinated by it in the first place?
Yeah, that goes back to Lydia Kavraki. So I wanted to go to Rice to be a postdoc under Lydia Kavraki because I thought the research that she's doing, both on motion planning as well as on computational biology, was so fascinating. And I went there and used the fact that I was there to have everybody else explain to me computational biology from a motion planning perspective. So I organized a seminar where all of Lydia's students and postdocs that were working on this were giving presentations. And so I learned about the problem. And then my naivete kicked in and I said, that problem must be easy. You know, the way you're describing it, it's just gradient descent. That's not a difficult problem. We do that in robotics all the time. And so I thought with my robotic knowledge, I could contribute to this in some interesting way. But it turned out that it was much more difficult than I thought. And so then after I moved to Amherst, there was a student who had a biochemistry background. And I thought, well, you know, this is a good opportunity to try something out. So we had a little project. And then I went to Santa Cruz to give a presentation. And I mentioned at the end of it, I mentioned that this could possibly be solved through motion planning, right? It could possibly be applied to protein structure prediction. And then this person just pulled me off to the side and said, let's talk about this. Turns out she was a former postdoc of David Baker, who just recently won the Nobel Prize for his work on proteins. And so she talked to David Baker and said, I think this guy has some interesting ideas. And so I started talking with David Baker, and he wrote a letter of support for the grant that I wrote. And so then things happened, and we had a big grant and started working on this. And we just recently actually got out of this area just maybe a year or two ago, because with deep learning and OpenAI and these DeepMind, these big companies entering this field, I felt like a small research group with limited computational resources doesn't really have a chance.
So yeah, you just talked about all the companies getting into the space. So I think in 2024, Demis Hassabis got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his work on AlphaFold.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of specific breakthrough they actually accomplished and what were they able to deliver?
So I find this is a very interesting story from many perspectives, including the perception of science to the general public. Actually, if you ask me, I think the breakthrough that they accomplished was, number one of engineering. They had, you know, a huge team of professional engineers. And two, one of integration. They used deep learning to fuse together information sources that people had come up with before. Right? I mean, so they took the research that people had developed before and they optimally integrated it. And, you know, I mean, obviously there are deep contributions in what they did, but I think everybody just attributes it to deep learning and says, you know, deep learning solved that problem. I think deep learning played an important part in solving that problem, but the important part was to correctly fuse the information that was available already before from many different sources. That the perception, and also, obviously, what these companies want to make you believe is that really this is proof that deep learning solves everything. When in fact, I think it's proof that deep learning is a very useful tool for a specific kind of problem. And in this particular case, it was the fusion of information. Because you don't know, you have several sources of information, and in biology, everything is complicated, so they contradict each other. How do you actually integrate this into a coherent idea of what the protein actually looks like? And for this, you need to decide, how much do I trust this source? How much do I trust this other source, given what I know about the problem? And this is what deep learning is perfect for, right? To kind of realize in these kinds of situations, that's the right information source. You know, you trust that to 75%, and then you trust this other information source to 25%, right? So this is exactly these complicated connections. That's, I think, something that neural nets excel at. And that's how they did it. I mean, the Nobel Prize absolutely wanted that was considered forever and ever the holy grail of molecular biology, to predict the structure of proteins. And I wouldn't say that we've solved it for example, you know, for membrane proteins that sit in the membrane of cells. We still can't do it, and there are proteins that don't really have one particular structure. They're called disordered proteins. They're kind of more like a bunch of thread hanging out in a liquid. So there's still really interesting science to be done, but the progress that they made was a major breakthrough.
And so when we talk about protein folding, basically we could visualize this as a protein, maybe like a long thread or something, which then folds itself into like a stable configuration. And I think there's also this Levinthal's paradox, which basically says there are so many different ways of how the protein could fold itself. And nature has actually found a really smart way and a very quick way to actually fold to like a stable configuration. So why do you think that is, and what does nature maybe do differently compared to our algorithms which we have?
Well, it is a necessity for nature to make proteins fold safe and reliably, right? Imagine you climb Mount Everest, all of a sudden there's much less pressure on your cells, and the proteins decide to fold differently. I mean, you die. Imagine you have a fever, so the temperature is different, the proteins decide to fold differently, you die. Imagine a changed pH level in your cells, that happens all the time, you die, right? So that's not very useful. Nature had to figure out a reliable way under a variety of conditions to produce these proteins, which are the building blocks of life. So how did that happen? I mean, I think that's exactly evolution, through trial and error. Many things had to die before we could have the kind of proteins that we have right now. And out of all possible proteins, the proteins that we have are just small islands in a huge space. So these are, in some sense, you could say, highly engineered, specialized proteins. So yeah, that's why they fall and fold. And why is it so difficult for us to do this? Well, the protein, when it folds, uses, in some sense, arbitrary amounts of parallel computation, right? The force fields between a positive charge and a negative charge, or between different covalent electrons, right? These are all happening in parallel. And you add more molecules, it doesn't matter. It's just more parallelism. It's all happening at the same time. Whereas if you want to compute that, if you want to simulate it, you have to go through all of these interactions, calculate them, and then see what happens if you all add them up, right? And so while nature can do things in parallel, we ultimately, at least with the current dominant computational paradigm, which is kind of digital computation, we have to do it in sequence. And there's so many inaccuracies in our models and things that just cause vastly different outcomes, that this is a really, really difficult computational problem.
And do you think it's almost solved now, or is there still like some problems which we have to overcome?
I think that there are still fundamental challenges. But the question is, what does solved mean? I mean, are we in a situation where pharmaceutical companies can save millions, hundreds of millions of dollars because they can cut out some trials because they did the simulation? Yes, we can, right? So that is already a useful solution if a company can save hundreds of millions. So I think we have a solution, not for all problems, but a solution that's already useful for many things.
And so going away from protein folding again, so one other project which you started in your research group is interactive perception, which I would say is basically the idea that that robot is not only like a passive observer of the environment, but instead like it's an active observer which actually goes to an object and it tries to out different things to figure out what is actually the functionality of an object, right? So this is actually a super interesting idea. How did you come up with it? And what inspired you to do that?
Necessity is the short answer. So we had built up a mobile manipulator at UMass Amherst, an XR4000 with a WAM 7-degree freedom arm on top of it and a Barrett 3-fingered hand. And it took a while to kind of get all the controllers and everything, so to get the infrastructure. But at some point, we had it. We had motion planning algorithms that combined planning and control to make the thing move around our lab reliably, not hitting anything. So that was good, right?
No.
Okay. What was the next thing? Well, the next thing for the robot is to leave the lab. So for that, it has to open a door. And at that point, actually, there were lots of labs that were doing door opening. And they were saying, okay, a door is something that's like this, rectangular shape. At this height, there's a knob or some kind of contraption. You need to turn. So people were basically programming what doors are. And I thought that was kind of boring. And I thought, okay, the door is actually really an articulated object, right? There are degrees of freedom, and these degrees of freedom encode the function. I need to press down on something so that this little latch gets retracted. Then I can open the door, another degree of freedom. So that is all of a sudden the question, how do we see degrees of freedom in the world? So we moved away from solving only the door problem and said, well, the door problem is just one instance of the robot discovering what works in the world. And so that's how we started. We said, well, so let's put we started first in 2D, and we had like a big garden cutter for hedges. And we said, okay, so let the robot play with it, and now from its own perception of the thing that it manipulated, it should extract what the actual degree of freedom is, so that then it could manipulate it the right way. And that's how this started, right? We were thinking about, should we call it interactive perception, or should we call it perceptive manipulation? But then we decided for interactive perception.
Sounds catchier.
Sounds catchier, right? And also to give credit, right? I mean, there was this field of active perception before, where most of the work, I think probably nearly all of the work, was about positioning the camera, right? And you could view interactive perception as a subset of that, where in addition to just moving about the camera, you can actually also impart forces on the world to create new perceptual signals that otherwise wouldn't be there. Because looking at a door, you don't know, did somebody put super glue? Is it shut? Is it not shut? You have to try it out. Otherwise, you cannot find out.
And what do you think are maybe applications which could be possible if this technology is matured? So how could this impact our society?
You mean interactive perception?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think interactive perception is a basic skill that robots have to have if we want to put them into environments that are not specifically designed for the robot, right? I think it happens to all of us every once in a while that we are in a hotel and we want to take a shower, and somehow the knobs are new, right? And we have to play around to figure out how it is, right? So that's a basic skill that we've gone through so many times that we don't really use it anymore, right? But I think it's a necessary precondition for enabling all the other things that we do on a daily basis, and also as a way of failure recovery or failure detection even, right? So I think it's a very basic skill, and there are probably many of these skills that we need to be able to get to this high level skill that we have when we perform tasks in the real world.
Yeah, good. Then we can maybe move on, talking about higher level skills. So we talked a little bit about motion generation, protein folding, interactive perception. Those are all what I would say like instances of even hallmarks of intelligent behavior. So I guess it's not by chance that you wanted to at some point bring all of your expertise together, which brings me to the second chapter of our podcast today, where I want to talk a little bit about the nature and science of intelligence. And I want to start this with something which the British neuroscientist Daniel Wolpert, which you also know, said. He said, the only reason we have a brain is to produce adaptable and complex movements. And I guess this ties in really perfectly with your own research, right? So where your focus is, of course, heavily on motion generation. Could you elaborate on what makes motion actually such an important consideration, and why does it seem so fundamental to intelligence?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because I'm in turmoil about the answer. So yesterday we talked with plant scientists about the motion of plants, and plants do move, right? I mean, if you watch plants in this kind of video, it even seems that they're doing deliberate motion and searching their environment, following the sun. Vines are looking for points to attach to. So yeah, it's unclear what motion are we really talking about. And then plants have brains, at least not in the sense of Wolpert's quote. So we need to be very careful. This quote might still be true, right? We only have brains because we need to do complex motion. But it doesn't need to be true that in order to do complex motion, you actually have to have a brain. So I don't like the emphasis on the brain too much. Intelligence is something that encompasses all of our body. Of course, the brain plays a really, really important role. But to me, intelligence even encompasses the environment and interactions between the agent and the environment. If you take any animal out of its ecological niche and you put it in, let's take a squirrel underwater. That's maybe too cruel. But anyway, the squirrel won't be able to behave. It will just die. So
when you actually talk about movements of plants, this reminds me really about those vehicles from this Italian neuroscientist Valentin Braitenberg, which are basically very simple robots, which he describes, which can which have very simple sensors where they can follow light or where they can move towards a light or move away from a light. And this basically gives you this illusion of intelligent behavior, right? But I think for you, intelligent behavior is not really equivalent to intelligence, but instead you would basically say that there are some principles of intelligence which are basically the hallmark of intelligence, right? It's not the behavior, but more the principles behind it, right?
Brilliant example, right? I mean, you said it exactly right. So these Braitenberg vehicles are super simple. And I don't know, you said that people think they behave intelligently, like implying that they're actually not intelligent, right? So this tells us, well, I don't know, right? I mean, the question is, what is intelligence? And the answer is, we don't know. So we need to find a way to study a phenomenon that we know exists without being able to clearly define it, which is kind of an unusual situation, right? If you want to study, say, gravitation, you know exactly what you need to do. You just drop some stuff, right, and measure things. We're in the situation that we want to study something that we know exists because we see things behaving, but we cannot really say exactly what intelligence is. And so I think it's much more useful. I mean, intelligence is a super nice marketing term, right? Because everybody gets excited about it or scared or both. I think we should just talk about behavior because the Braitenberg vehicle behaves. Whether or not we want to call that intelligent actually is kind of irrelevant, right? It behaved in an interesting way. And then when somebody explains to you how it's actually constructed, there's this surprise moment because the construction is so simple that you're confused how it can generate such complex behavior, right? When you attribute, I mean, you know, people analyze the behavior of these vehicles and then attribute attractiveness or fear and right? I mean, this is a super simple thing that evokes in us emotions, right? We attribute emotions to it. So I think that's confusing. So let's just talk about behavior. And there's behavior of various complexities. At some point, we can get most people to agree that a particular degree of complexity, we would start calling it intelligent. But we don't care about that. Because if you can explain behavior, then we almost accidentally solve the intelligence, right?
But I think that also requires that we have a good shared understanding of what intelligence actually is. So
I guess most experts cannot agree on a definition, but maybe you have a good working definition of intelligence?
No. Well, I would advocate, let's forget about intelligence, right? And let's focus on behavior. And if we because it is not intelligent behavior, right? Intelligence is behavior. The only way intelligence manifests itself is through behavior. So we can postpone the question of what is intelligent and what is not intelligent until we've understood the way behavior is brought about by an agent in his interactions with the environment. Once we have understood that, then we've grounded the discussion about intelligence in something tangible, in mechanisms like the Braitenberg vehicle that produces a certain behavior, right? That discussion is now totally grounded because we can build it right now. So I think we should start to learn how to build things that behave in increasingly complex ways. And by complex I mean there's a huge gap between the complexity you put into the system under the hood and the complexity that the system is capable of producing, exactly as in the Braitenberg vehicle, which is the minimum example. It's a super simple mechanism inside the actual vehicle and it produces surprisingly complex behavior. That's what we're after, right? So if you understand how to bring about that magic by building something simple, generating very robust and very diverse behaviors that we didn't even anticipate, we're surprised by, that's something we need to understand first.
interesting.
So what do you actually think about the theory of multiple intelligences? Does it tie in with your maybe fundamental behaviors, which we need to first build until we can actually talk about intelligence? Or do you think this is already something which comes closer to the definition of it?
I think it's an admission of defeat, right? If you talk about intelligence and you say, oh, you know, we want to study intelligence, and then rather than defining what intelligence is, you're resorting to making a list of things and saying these are types of intelligence, then it shows that you didn't understand the root of the problem, and it doesn't show anything else. So I think we don't know what intelligence is. It's impossible for us to define. Smarter people than me have tried over decades, if not centuries. Let's acknowledge that, right? Many people have tried to define intelligence and have given up, and it's almost a joke, right? In the psychology community, they say, "Oh, intelligence is what intelligence tests measure," right? That is a circular, comical, ironic, sarcastic definition, right? So again, it's in some sense an admission of defeat. I don't know what intelligence is, so I need to give you a self-referential, tongue-in-cheek definition so that we can start talking about something else.
But, well, at least we can already measure intelligence, right?
We have the IQ test. We can say if you are more intelligent than I am.
Yeah, but is that true? I mean, yes, there are some things that we can very reliably measure, and it correlates amazingly well with all kinds of other things. I mean, also with life expectancy, with average income over your life, with health. Intelligence correlates what we measure, right? What the IQ tests measures, something that correlates really, really well. So what does that mean? Does that mean that whatever the intelligence test measured in itself is something so meaningful? I don't know. I maybe. It's helpful to make all kinds of predictions statistically, but I mean, I'm a positivist, right? I want to know how the thing works on the inside.
So you might actually say that this could be like a proxy towards intelligence test?
Well, it is a proxy for understanding, right? I mean, it's measuring it and it's saying, look, now we don't know what we measure, but I can tell you that it's useful what we measure. I mean, there's justification, right? I mean, there's a reason for that to exist. There's also a much dangerous notion of the IQ test, right? People use IQ tests to do all kinds of bad political, cultural arguments, right? So measuring sometimes can be good and sometimes can be bad.
So just let's go a little bit back to multiple intelligences, which is basically the idea that there are multiple ways of how you can be intelligent, right? You can be emotional intelligent, you can be kinesthetic intelligent. But this was is a bit strange to me. So for me, intelligence was always like this process of actually acquiring or becoming an expert in different fields. So you can become an expert in robotics or biology, but also like in emotions or music.
So would you basically agree that intelligence is actually the process of acquiring the knowledge or the expertise, or would you see it more as a manifestation of multiple intelligences, that there are actually different ways of how you can already be intelligent?
I really don't believe that we have these different modules somewhere. One is mathematical intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, emotional intelligence, right? I really think these are, you could take behavior and structure and categorize it in a million different ways. I'm not sure that's going to get you anywhere. You said a process, right? A process of learning something. And I think I'm much more sympathetic to this view or process. And I would want to go even one step further and ask, what is the internal structure of an agent that supports the process that leads to this kind of behavior, right? So I really would want to know the way the thing is built. In some sense, if you want to take the metaphor of a computer, I want to know, okay, there's an algorithmic logic unit, there's some registers, there's a memory, there's a long-term memory, right? It's really how does this thing need to be structured for the behavior that we're observing to arise? So in some sense, it's one step even below the process. The process already is when that machinery engages with the environment.
And so for you, basically, it's the building blocks of the process itself which exhibits intelligence or which leads to it.
Yeah. Building blocks is a little bit too specific. I mean, let's look at evolution, right? There's a tree of life, and we all go back to something billions of years ago. No, not billions of years ago, to some, maybe it's billions, to some origin, right? But then also at some point the birds split off and mammals came about, but there's a lot of shared ancestry, right? I mean, we share, I don't know how many % of the DNA with the animals, right? So there's a lot of shared things in all of us. So that's one reason why we might think that some of the solutions that we find in survival are also related. Also, we all are living in the same world, in the same physics. The way that we need to interact with that physics is driven by that physics. There must be some commonalities because we're addressing the same physics problems out there. And then also in evolution, things have occurred several times, right? The eye, I don't know, they've evolved a dozen times or something, right? So nature finds again and again, independently, similar solutions to similar problems. That means, that there's probably some structure in that problem that is worthy of exploitation. All of these are indications that different types of agents that exhibit intelligent behavior must share some underlying principles of generating that behavior, right? And so that, I think, is the easiest route to starting to crack that nut, to kind of open up that door, to get a glimpse at what is this complex behavior and how do we generate it. It's these shared principles that are shared across all living things, that I think are shared across all competent synthetic intelligences. And I would dare to speculate, if aliens visited us tomorrow, they also would exhibit these principles.
So let's talk about those principles in a moment. But before that, I just wanted to get back to a very interesting proposal which you once made, which you call the work Turing test. And so let me just read from your paper what the work Turing test is. So what is it? A robot passes the work Turing test if it can carry out any set of instructions by autonomously performing physical work, such that the resulting state of the world is indistinguishable from one that would result from a cooperative, capable, non-expert human carrying out the same instructions. And so, of course, this ties back to the original Turing test, which was this idea that you chat with a human and a robot, and you try to figure out which is which. And so if I understand your working Turing test correctly, then a practical implementation would be that we have maybe a room which I go in and I say some instructions like clean up this room and rearrange the furniture. And then I go out, something happens, I go in again, and I could judge there was a human or there was a robot. Well, I couldn't judge, basically.
Right.
Is that roughly how you envision this?
Yeah, I think that describes it. Interesting is also the opposite, right? If you have somebody with appendicitis laying on the table and you say, hey, please remove the appendix, and you come back and nothing has happened and the patient is dead, then you also don't know if it was a robot that couldn't operate or a human that couldn't operate, right? Because you can't expect an average human to be able to perform the extraction of an appendix. So that's why really we're testing against the average human. But I think that the past has shown that these Turing test type things don't lead to the progress that we really had hoped, right? They don't serve as a good benchmark. They lead to special purpose solutions that invoke in us the impression of what's behind is comparable to humans, but then doesn't necessarily end up doing that. So yeah, I still think it's an interesting idea, but I would not pursue this as a real benchmark for robotics today.
Okay, then let's get back to the principles of intelligence again. So you recently wrote a paper called Intelligence as Computation, where you basically propose that there are different principles of intelligence.
And I think one of those principles is active interconnection. So could you quickly talk about what active interconnection is and how we can implement this on real robots?
Yeah, that's not easy. And we have in my research group, we hold meetings where we discuss the answer to your question. So what I can give you is not a final answer. We are figuring out what these principles are exactly, But let me give you some pointers, right? So, let us start with the word active interconnection, right? Idea is that it interconnects two things at least, right? Or several things. So there's information flow between, let's say, the components of the system going both ways. What now distinguishes this idea that something is active? Information flow that's passive is just basic passing information back and forth. But if it's active, then you can imagine somebody maybe like a conductor of an orchestra sitting on that connection and saying which information gets through, which information doesn't get through, or even how information needs to be changed before it gets passed through. So there really is an agent on that connection that is doing something that wasn't there before, right? In some sense, you could say the components of a system ultimately functions, right? Or relations, which is one type of function, right? And the active interconnection is a function on those functions. And so we're introducing kind of a hierarchy of regularities, right? If you have a computer vision system that is tracking an object, it's using some visuals regularities. If you want to have a hand that grabs this object, you're using some other reality to drive what the hand is doing. And now there could be an agent that sits in between, that it informs these two processes of each other, but in a way that is knowledgeable about what's actually going on. So The idea is that by combining things, not just with cables, which is I think what we've been mostly doing in engineering, but engineering is predominantly based on divide and conquer. Software engineering is entirely based on divide and conquer, right? Good software architecture is one that's highly modular, where little information is passed between the different modules, right? So we've gone the exact opposite way of what I'm describing. But the idea is that because of this level of modulation, we take two things that could behave in the way that they behave, and now they can behave in many, many more different ways. We're growing the behavioral repertoire of the agent by orchestrating in adaptive ways how these two components function. And this is explaining how these recover behaviors come about. Because, all of a sudden we have a behavioral repertoire that's way beyond what the components themselves can do, that depends on the world state, that adjusts these components to do the right thing in the right moment. So I know that that's an abstract concept, and, I wish I could give you a simple formula, right, that takes places. And we're working on this. We're making progress on making this more and more concrete. But yeah. For right now, I think the most important thing is to say, if you have two skills, but these two skills can now be compensated, combined and complemented in new ways that are clever, then obviously you can do more than with these two skills alone. And so that's one principle that we're saying, this idea of either modeling behavior or producing behavior using a structure that resembles this is a good idea. And we validated this in many, many different species, where we make models using these active interconnections, right? In some sense, it's a modeling language. And it gives far-reaching predictions of what how these things behave. We simulated parts of the human visual system and how it reacts to visual illusions. And looking at our model, which is exceedingly simple, it consists of 3 components, that's it. We could find new properties in our model and then check that they exist in the human system. So even though this model is so simple, it captures some essence of what the human visual system does, and we can use this model as a stand-in to investigate new properties of the human system. And again, I mentioned this before, right, that what matters is the discrepancy between simplicity of what we put in and the complexity, useful complexity of what comes out. And whenever we use active interconnections with very simple input and the output, the behavior is surprisingly complex than this.
And so the way I can I can visualize this is basically that you have a set of basic skills
which are interconnected, and then there is a higher level algorithm which basically decides in which way we let information flow between those components, right?
Absolutely, but except that this high level algorithm is gradient descent, right? There's no high level. Basically,
is that so? It all comes down to gradient descent in the end.
Yes. Well, okay. So now it starts getting interesting, right? So gradient descent is what we would associate with control. And we would say that the problem of local minima, you
so
might be...
maybe before we go there, just quickly.
So gradient descent is, of course, this idea that you start somewhere and you try to go into the direction of where you minimize a certain cost, right? Yes. So as an example, maybe you have a ball which is sitting somewhere and it's rolling downhill, and basically the cost in that case would be how far it goes down, right? Yeah. And so the way we picture this usually is like maybe like a bowl or something, where you start somewhere along the bowl and you want to go towards the optimal, the minimal, the lower point of the bowl, right?
Yes. Yeah, and so obviously that can cause trouble, because if I now want to go to the restroom, I shouldn't pick the direction where the restroom is. I should pick the direction where the door is to leave the room, and they might be opposite directions. So if I just, as my goal to get to the restroom, then I might just be heading towards a wall and I will get stuck, right? So this is the problem, and that's why people use planning, because planning can get out of these what's called local minima. Now we found that some problems that are traditionally considered planning problems can be solved with gradient descent using active interconnections. And then we found out that the way they fail, then, for example, the Tower of Hanoi, it's like this, where you stack different disks on top of each other. There are some rules you need to follow. There's a simplified version of that. It's called the Towers of London. Neuroscientists use this to test the cognitive abilities of Parkinson's and Alzheimer patients, or in general of patients with neurodegenerative diseases. it turns out that our algorithm fails the same way that these Alzheimer patients fail, or fails on the same problems. So that could show that maybe the human system, there actually is a planning system for really, really complex problems. But then it's using this gradient-based descent with active interconnections for those where it's not necessary.
So to summarize, our current state of robotics is basically that we have robots which have Alzheimer's disease.
Well, I think we have many, many other things also, but I would say that it's not anymore the state, actually, because we have now discovered that we can overcome this by interfering with the gradient at the right time in the right way. So we can now solve even more complex planning problems if we interfere with the gradient.
So it's a bit like the prefrontal cortex going in and saying, okay, we don't want to do this behavior now. We want to plan something over a long horizon or something. So because the prefrontal cortex is usually associated with planning, right, and high-level reasoning, so do you also think the same way about the algorithm in this case?
Well, I don't know enough about the brain to really speak to that, but I think my idea of what the prefrontal cortex does is at a higher level of abstraction. This is really kind of low-level stuff.
So, but this sounds very similar.
Yeah. I mean, basically, I think one of the things we've learned about these principles is that they reoccur at different levels of abstraction. And so the fact that there's self-similarity within the information processing system of a human is, to me, completely expected.
You study intelligence really from a computer science perspective. But some years ago, you wanted to understand intelligence also from other viewpoints. And so you started this excellence cluster, Science of Intelligence. How did you actually come up with this idea, and what kind of expertise did you want to bring together?
Yeah, there's two strands, I think, to that answer. One is the scientific one, where we started working on, you mentioned interactive perception. And then I don't know even how I found it, but there's a book by a neuroscientist philosopher called Action and Perception. The guy's called Alva Noon, the book's called Action and Perception. And I read that book and I was shocked because, passages in that book could have come from our group meetings discussing research. It was one-to-one it was the same way of thinking. And then I came to I realized, oh my God, there's all these other communities out there thinking about the same problem, and sometimes in exactly the same way, but they have all kinds of different skills. They have different ways of gaining insights. How could we benefit if all of our insights would be fused, right? What other conclusions that we could draw then? And so that was kind of the germination cell, if you want, of Science of Intelligence. Many, many things, and I think probably over a decade passed between that moment and SciOI actually getting funded. But that was the core idea. And then there's the administrative question. How did it actually happen? And it happened because Raul Rojas, a robotics professor from FU, after I had came back from the US and started working in Berlin, approached me and said, hey, we should do something. There's this excellence initiative. Let's start doing something. And, we just started as diffuse as that, right? As vague as that. And so we started including more people and discussing and including more disciplines. And somehow this evolved over time.
And how do you actually manage such a diverse amount of people, so many different disciplines, so many different expertises?
I think it would be exaggerated to say that I manage that, right? Yes, it's, that you cannot tell professors what to do, right? But I think what I try to do is to create a structure that would push people into a certain direction in terms of how they do research. So one thing we did when we started was we included new disciplines incrementally. So we started off with robotics, right? And then we invited psychologists and had a workshop, like a one-day workshop, where we discussed our things and discovered that we had similarities, right? That there were the same problems that we're thinking about, maybe with different words from different perspectives. And that created an immediate bonding inside the group, right? Because all of a sudden we had things to talk about. And then there are levels, right? In the first meeting, everybody thinks that you understand what the other person's saying. 3 weeks later, you realize you thought you understood, but you didn't. But now you're kind of hooked and you're working through the difficulties until you then find a common language. But we did this slice by slice, adding one discipline at a time. in this incremental way, and having a group that already had achieved some cohesion, I think created kind of a spirit of, hey, yeah, I mean, we're all thinking about similar things. I think that was really, really important and formative. And then the cluster had many structural elements that forced people to meet each other, like, people share random offices, not only within the project, but across disciplines. In order to get funding we had this internal funding program where you could apply for research projects. People had to come from different disciplines, had to be studying biological intelligence and artificial intelligence. And so in the beginning, people were like, my God, that is so annoying. Why do we have to do this? But the money made them do it. And then over time, people realized, oh my God, this is actually really interesting. And we're doing kind of research that nobody can do, and we're having results that seem really interesting. So people, I think, gradually started buying into it, into investing in this additional effort of getting to know another discipline, because the scientific potential actually is so significant.
So let's look very quickly a bit at the future. So if you look at the state of the art in robotics, and if we extrapolate a little bit also from your research, what do you think are the next big breakthroughs which we can expect in robotics, and what could be possible in the next years?
I mean, it's always difficult to speculate about the future, right? In a field that's moving as fast as this whole field, and where there's so many people and so much money, I think making predictions is very difficult. Maybe it's easier to say what I think should happen. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a cooling down of our excitement about large language models. I'm not saying they should go away or anything like that, right? I mean, I'm saying that any healthy discipline pursues multiple approaches. I find it impossible to believe that large language models are the last technology humans ever invent, right? So that's not likely. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
I mean, I completely acknowledge that it's possible that it is, right? It is possible. It's a non-zero probability. I'm just saying I really don't think so, and I would bet money against it. And I feel the evidence is accumulating, right? More and more papers coming out that are pointing to fundamental limitations of large language models, not necessarily in the context of language, but as a universal problem solver, right? People are in the idea that large language models can solve everything. And that's, I mean, the no free lunch theorem already seems a little bit of an indication that that can be true.
Can you quickly say what's the no free lunch theorem?
The no free lunch theory basically says that if you have a solution to a problem and it works well, don't fool yourself. This solution works arbitrarily badly on an infinite number of other problems. So there's no universal solution that solves all problems, right? And that's the mathematical theory. We can now argue whether that statement actually holds or not, because that theorem only holds about all possible worlds. And we live in a very specific world. So it could be that within that world, all the problems that we encounter have so much in common that there could be one algorithm that solves them all. So also that is still possible. Again, if I had to put money on it, I would bet against it. So I think that it would be really interesting for us to say, if this is not the last technology, what will be the next technology? And in order to answer that question, we need to start looking for alternatives, which I think is incredibly productive, right? I mean, we're bound to come up with something interesting, so why don't we do that, right? I mean, why is everybody running after large language models or foundation models, or what the most recent term is, right? Because like they keep throwing changes to it, and then vision, whatever, right? I mean, there's all these different names. I think I would like to see a little bit more diversity in research, and that would open the opportunity for us to discuss across these different branches, pursuing different ideas, right? And that, I think, would be incredibly productive for our field. And when I say our field, I would like to probably implicitly include, robotics and AI. These are things, they really are something we need to put together, at least overlap in a significant amount. And that would be really interesting if we can find out for which kind of problems, which types of solutions are the most appropriate ones. I think we'd be much cleverer than just all using one hammer on all problems that we encounter.
I think that is a good time to wrap it up. Thank you so much for this podcast episode, Oliver.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
It was a real pleasure.